South Africa views the intimidation and harassment of the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the Palestinian territory, occupied since 1967, Ms. Francesca Albanese, in a serious light, and calls on those responsible for such to desist their unlawful actions. Mr. President, the work of the special procedure mechanisms will be particularly important going forward for purposes of the collection and preservation of evidence that lies at the heart of ensuring accountability and justice, which is precisely what L30 seeks to achieve. It is only through ensuring accountability and justice that we can end the impunity that has entrenched the ongoing unlawful occupation together with its apartheid policies, as well as discharge our solemn obligation under the Genocide Convention, which enjoins us to prevent and punish those responsible for genocide. Thank you, Mr. President. South Africa wishes to express its appreciation to the OIC and the mission of the State of Palestine for tabling L30, as this is the very first time that this Council will take action on the unprecedented onslaught taking place in Gaza. Our silence has been truly deafening, with some displaying double standards and the height of hypocrisy. In just over 180 days, at least 32,975 Palestinians have been killed, including 14,500 children. These figures, however, provide only a glimpse of the untold human suffering taking place on our watch. Yet while the Council has been silent, the special procedure mechanisms that support its work have not been bowed. South Africa salutes their unwavering commitment to amplify the voices of the victims, despite being subjected to unconscionable threats and abuse. Indeed, they warned the Council as far back as 16 November that the grave violations being committed against the Palestinian people pointed to a genocide in the making. Their efforts are embedded in South Africa's papers before the ICJ. They informed the determination of the court concerning the plausible risk of genocide, together with its subsequent orders, including its most recent order, which was issued on 28 March in response to the significant deterioration in the situation. Their efforts are also embedded in a number of other interventions that are taking place, including the recent decision by the UN Security Council. It therefore remains crucial that we ensure that Israel respects and implements ICJ orders together with UNSC resolutions demanding an immediate and lasting ceasefire, which L30 will no doubt contribute in securing. We can no longer choose to apply a parallel system of international law to Israel, nor can we be complicit in facilitating its actions. For international law to be credible, it must be uniformly applied. It must serve the victims that it is designed to protect, rather than those with power who treat it with contempt. South Africa therefore calls on members of this Council to bring an end to any selectivity and double standard and to adopt L30 by consensus. Accordingly, we wish to echo the recent statement by the High Commissioner in Gaza, urging us, and I quote, to avert a new era of power politics that cast aside norms and institutions so painstakingly built to advance them. Our universal rights and fundamental humanity depend on reversing any such trajectory. I thank you.
I thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your comment. And we will give the floor to the countries concerned, to begin by Israel. Mrs. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. For years, Israel has been calling on this Council to condemn Hamas, to call out its inhumanity, and to call for accountability and justice for Israeli victims of terrorism. Yet even after the worst massacre against the Jewish people since the Holocaust, indeed one of the deadliest and most brutal terrorist attacks of modern times, this Council has once again failed to do so. So let me ask, how many dead Israelis will it take to condemn Hamas? 1,200 murdered is not enough. What atrocities will warrant condemnation? The rape, mutilation, and torture of Israelis was not enough. How many victims must there be for this Council to address Palestinian terrorism? How many stockpiles of weapons, terrorist headquarters, tunnel shafts must be revealed in hospitals, schools, and UN facilities before this Council takes upon itself to denounce the use of civilian infrastructure by Palestinian terrorist organizations? According to the resolution before you today, Israel has no right to protect its people, while Hamas has every right to murder and torture innocent Israelis. Israel should have stood idly by on October 7th as Hamas unleashed its barbaric acts. On October 8th, it should have allowed Hamas to do so again. According to this resolution, states should not sell arms to Israel in its endeavor to defend its population, but they can continue to arm Hamas, supplying them with the same weapons which was pointed at Amit Susna's head as she was being sexually assaulted in Hamas captivity. According to this resolution, there is some kind of distorted equivalence drawn between the hostages still held by Hamas and the Hamas terrorists themselves. That 1-year-old Kfir Bibas and the other 133 hostages held by Hamas are equal to Manar Mahmoud Muhammad Qasem, an Islamic Jihad terrorist who admitted to raping a woman on October 7th. Mr. President, this Council has long abandoned the Israeli people and long defended Hamas. It has become a shield for terrorists. It has turned a blind eye to any acts of violence against Israelis and Jews. I call on members of this Council, do not succumb to this manifestly distorted text. A vote yes is a vote for Hamas, a vote for ignoring the slaughter and rape of my people, a vote for legitimizing Palestinian terrorism and incitement while delegitimizing the very real fight against anti-Semitism. A vote for undermining Israel's right to defend itself, for equating the plight of 134 hostages held by Hamas with Hamas themselves. Israel will continue to fight Hamas. We will continue to defend our people, and we will bring all 134 hostages back home. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. We all agree that far too many civilians have been killed in this conflict and that every civilian death is a tragedy. We are outraged and heartbroken by the deaths of 7 humanitarian workers from World Central Kitchen in Gaza on Monday, including 1 American citizen. Incidents like this simply should not happen. Protection of all civilian life is both a moral and strategic imperative, and Israel has not done enough to mitigate civilian harm. We continue to express grave concern at the unprecedented loss of life and the lack of adequate humanitarian assistance that has placed men, women, and children in Gaza on the brink of widespread starvation. Hamas's brutal terrorist attack on Israel irreparably shattered many lives. We demand the release of hostages that Hamas has held for 6 months as of tomorrow. Every state, including Israel, has an obligation to defend itself, and Israel has the right to prevent the events of October 7th from ever happening again. And how Israel does so matters. The United States has repeatedly urged Israel to deconflict military operations against Hamas with humanitarian operations in order to avoid civilian casualties and to ensure humanitarian actors can carry out their essential mission in safety. That has not happened. And in just 6 months, more humanitarians have been killed in this conflict than in any war of the modern era. That is why President Biden has underscored the need for an immediate ceasefire by all parties, which is essential to stabilize and improve the humanitarian situation and protect innocent civilians. We urge Prime Minister Netanyahu to empower his negotiators to conclude a deal without delay to bring the hostages home, and Hamas to accept the deal on the table. Turning to draft Resolution L30 before us today, we are deeply concerned by its many problematic elements, too many to name in full. For example, there is no specific condemnation of Hamas for perpetrating the horrific October 7th attacks. Neither is there any reference to the terrorist nature of those actions. While we appreciate the addition of language calling for the immediate release of hostages, unfortunately, the text makes no distinction between hostages who were brutally abducted by a terrorist organization that heeds no international law, whose whereabouts are unknown, and who, according to credible UN reporting, are likely experiencing repeated sexual violence, and detainees whose fate is regulated and governed by legal processes. Let me be clear, these groups are not equivalent. Finally, the text draws a number of conclusions about the conduct of the conflict that have not been sufficiently evidenced. The United States is determined to bring life-saving aid to Gaza, to push for an end to the conflict, and to bring about a lasting, just, and stable two-state solution. Unfortunately, draft Resolution L30 does nothing to further those aims. For all of these reasons, we regret that we must call a vote and urge fellow member states to join us in voting no. I thank you.
I thank you, Mrs. Ambassador, for your explanations. I now give the floor to you, Mr. Ambassador of Ghana.
Mr. President, Ghana abstained from the vote on the resolution on advancing human rights in South Sudan because we believe that continued engagement between this Council and the South Sudanese authorities are necessary to advance human rights in South Sudan. We note the concerns of the South Sudanese authorities and believe that those concerns and the importance of respecting the principles, modalities, and mechanisms of the human rights systems are not mutually exclusive. We believe that finding agreement on recommendations for setting up institutions or fact-finding missions are a central pillar of the human rights architecture and a necessary condition for safeguarding utility, relevance, and value of the Human Rights Council. We nonetheless commend the penholder and the members of the core group for their hard work and willingness to push the frontiers of constructive engagement with all members of the Council and with South Sudan in particular. We believe that the positive approach has helped a great deal to narrow the scope of disagreements and will provide the conditions required for further engagement with the leadership of South Sudan in transitioning the country through the present delicate stage of the implementation of the revitalized peace agreement. Mr. President, like others, Ghana also recognizes that more must be done to improve the livelihoods of the South Sudanese people, as well as their access to justice. Attention must be paid to victims of abuse and unfair treatment, especially those relating to sexual violence. We therefore encourage the South Sudanese authorities to remain committed to building the relevant state institutions whose work and mandate remain critical to realizing the aspirations of the South Sudanese people. Finally, the international community cannot afford continuing divisions and polarizations over the security and humanitarian situation prevailing in some parts of South Sudan, where in some instances communal violence is rife and impunity still remain unpunished. Ghana therefore urges a unified and a consensus approach on matters concerning South Sudan. Thank you.
I thank you, Mr. Ambassador.